A cruel millionaire threw his daughter out of the house for loving a humble farmer. When he visited her to see how hard her life was, he was stunned by what he saw. The grand dining room of the Whitmore estate was as opulent as ever, with its gleaming crystal chandeliers and polished mahogany table that stretched endlessly. Yet, the tension in the air overshadowed the luxury. Richard Whitmore sat at the head of the table, his expression as rigid as the cold marble fireplace behind him. His piercing blue eyes bore into his daughter, Emily, who sat across from him, nervously twisting the hem of her blouse. "I've made arrangements for you to meet Daniel Westwood next week," Richard announced, his voice firm and final, as though he were sealing a business deal. "His family is highly respected, and this match will secure your future and ours." Emily's heart sank. She had always known her father was controlling, but this, arranging her life without even consulting her, it was too much. "Father," she began, her voice shaky but resolute, "I can't meet Daniel Westwood or anyone else for that matter. I'm already in love." The words hung in the air like an unexpected storm. Richard's face hardened, his jaw tightening as he set down his glass of wine with a sharp clink. "In love," he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "And who, pray tell, is this man who's stolen your heart?" Emily swallowed hard, her cheeks flushing. "His name is Michael. He's a farmer." "A farmer?" Richard's laugh was cold and sharp, like breaking glass. "You, my daughter, with a farmer. Do you understand the absurdity of what you're saying?" Emily's hands balled into fists on her lap. She knew this wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected outright ridicule. "Michael is kind, hardworking, and he loves me for who I am, not for my last name or your fortune. Isn't that what matters?" "What matters," Richard snapped, rising to his feet, "is that you understand your duty. Our family has built an empire, Emily. You don't just throw that away for some romantic fantasy with a man who can barely provide for himself." Emily stood too, her chair scraping against the polished floor. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing happiness. I won't marry someone I don't love, no matter how much money or prestige they have." Richard's face darkened, a storm brewing in his eyes. "You are naive if you think love will sustain you. Life is harsh, and without the resources to survive, love will crumble. Mark my words." Tears pricked at the corners of Emily's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had made her choice, and no amount of intimidation would make her back down. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Father, but I'm not changing my mind." Richard stared at her, his face unreadable for a long moment. Then, with a tone as cold as ice, he delivered his final blow. "If you walk out of this house to be with him, don't bother coming back. You will no longer be my daughter." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had anticipated resistance, anger even, but not this, not total abandonment. Still, she straightened her spine, her voice trembling but firm. "If that's what it takes, so be it." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard turned his back to her, a silent dismissal. Emily stood frozen for a moment, tears now streaming freely down her face. Then, with a deep breath, she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. That night, Emily packed a single suitcase. Her childhood room, once filled with warmth and memories, now felt like a stranger's domain. She glanced around one last time, taking in the photos, the books, and the trinkets that had defined her life up until this moment. Then, without a backward glance, she slipped out of the house, the cool night air biting at her cheeks. Michael was waiting for her at the edge of the estate, his old pickup truck idling on the gravel road. When she saw him, the tension in her chest eased slightly. His warm smile, the way he opened the door for her, the gentle squeeze of his hand on hers. It was all the reassurance she needed. "Are you sure about this?" Michael asked, his voice soft but steady. Emily nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." As they drove away, the towering gates of the Whitmore estate faded into the distance. Emily felt a mixture of fear and relief. She was leaving everything she had ever known, but she was also stepping toward a future of her own making, a future filled with love, hope, and Michael. Unbeknownst to her, Richard watched from an upstairs window. His hands were clasped behind his back, his knuckles white from the force of his grip. Pride and fury warred within him. But there was a flicker of something else, something he refused to acknowledge. Deep down, he already felt the first pangs of regret. The sun was beginning to set as Emily and Michael pulled up to his family's modest farmhouse. The warm orange glow of the sky reflected off the weathered wooden planks, casting long shadows across the fields. It was a humble place, nothing like the sprawling Whitmore estate, but to Emily, it felt like freedom. Michael turned off the engine and looked at her, his brown eyes full of concern. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked softly. "There's no turning back now." Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision settle on her shoulders. "I've never been more ready," she said, though her voice wavered just slightly. She looked out at the wide-open fields, the scent of fresh earth and grass filling her lungs. This was her new life now. As they stepped out of the truck, Michael's mother, Margaret, appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face broke into a warm smile. "You're back," she called, her voice full of relief. Then she noticed Emily standing beside him. "And you brought company." Emily smiled nervously, clutching her bag tighter. "Hello, Mrs. Evans. I'm Emily." Margaret's eyes softened as she took in the young woman's trembling composure. She saw something in Emily that reminded her of fragile glass, delicate yet determined not to break. "Come on in, sweetheart," she said, holding the door open. "You must be exhausted." Emily stepped inside the farmhouse, the scent of baked bread and roasted chicken welcoming her. The kitchen was small, cozy, and bursting with life. Pots clanged gently on the stove, and the faint hum of a radio filled the background. "You'll stay in the guest room," Margaret said. "It's not much, but it's comfortable." Emily set her suitcase down by the doorway, her heart hammering in her chest. The reality of the situation was settling in. She had left behind wealth and comfort for a life she didn't yet fully understand. Doubts crept in, whispering that maybe she was being foolish, that maybe her father was right. But when Michael took her hand and squeezed it gently, the doubts faded. This was where she wanted to be, where she needed to be. After dinner, they sat on the porch, the night air cool against Emily's skin. The stars stretched endlessly above them, unpolluted by city lights. It was beautiful in a way that the Whitmore estate had never been. Michael leaned back, his fingers entwined with hers. "We'll make this work," he promised. "No matter what." She nodded, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I know we will." But deep inside, a voice whispered that things wouldn't be so simple. Her father's cold stare and final words echoed in her mind. "You will no longer be my daughter." The thought was like a knife twisting in her chest. Richard Whitmore was not a man who changed his mind easily, and she knew that her choice wouldn't be without consequences. Meanwhile, back at the Whitmore estate, Richard sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across the room, but no warmth touched him. He stared into the flames, his jaw clenched tight. "She'll come back," he muttered to himself. "She'll realize soon enough that love can't pay the bills or secure a future." His mind raced through memories of Emily as a child, the little girl who used to run to him with scraped knees and tear-streaked cheeks. She had trusted him, looked up to him, and now she had thrown all of that away for a farmer. The thought filled him with a bitter rage. He had worked his entire life to build an empire, to ensure his family's name was synonymous with success and prestige. How could she not see that he was only trying to protect her? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His butler, James, entered with a bow. "Mr. Whitmore, everything is prepared for your meeting tomorrow." Richard waved him off, barely registering the words. Fine, leave me." As James exited, Richard's gaze fell on a framed photograph on his desk, Emily's high school graduation. She was beaming, her eyes bright with hope and ambition. He remembered how proud he had felt that day, convinced that she would follow the path he had laid out for her. Now, that path was gone, shattered by her defiance. He took a long sip of his whiskey, the bitterness spreading through him. He didn't want to admit it, but a sliver of doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. What if she didn't come back? What if she actually succeeded in that new life she had chosen? The idea seemed impossible. Emily was his daughter, a Whitmore. She couldn't possibly be happy living a simple life with a man who had nothing to his name. Could she? The uncertainty was a foreign feeling, one that Richard didn't know how to handle. He clenched his fists, willing it away. She'll fail, he told himself, and when she does, she'll come crawling back. But as he drained his glass and stared at the empty room around him, an unfamiliar emptiness settled in his chest. For the first time, Richard Whitmore wondered if he had made a mistake. Emily woke to the gentle sound of birds chirping outside the window, sunlight streaming in through the thin curtains. The air smelled of fresh hay and wildflowers, a stark contrast to the sterile, perfumed air of her father's mansion. For a moment, she allowed herself to just breathe it in, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. But reality settled in quickly. As she dressed, her fingers lingered on the locket around her neck, a gift from her mother before she passed away. It was a silent reminder of the life she had left behind. Her father's words still echoed in her mind, sharp and unyielding. "You will no longer be my daughter." She shook off the heaviness and went downstairs. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, and she found Michael and his mother, Margaret, sitting at the kitchen table. "Morning, sleepyhead," Michael said with a warm smile, pushing a mug of coffee toward her. "Morning," she replied, taking the mug gratefully. The warmth seeped through her hands, grounding her. Margaret looked up from her plate, her eyes kind but observant. "How did you sleep, dear?" "Surprisingly well," Emily admitted. "It's peaceful here," Margaret nodded, wiping her hands on a napkin. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need. This house may not be much, but there's always room for family." Family, the word caught in Emily's throat. She smiled, though it felt fragile. "Thank you. That means a lot." Michael reached for her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "We'll figure this out together," he assured her. "You don't have to face anything alone." She nodded, grateful for his support, but she couldn't shake the gnawing anxiety in her chest. This wasn't just about finding a new home. It was about rebuilding her entire life from the ground up after breakfast. Emily and Michael headed out to the fields. The farm stretched endlessly under a clear blue sky. Rows of corn and wheat swayed in the breeze, the earth rich and fertile. It was hard, honest work, and Emily admired the way Michael moved through it all with practiced ease. "This is your world," she said, watching as he adjusted the irrigation hose. "I'm still trying to figure out where I fit in." Michael straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. "You fit in wherever you want to," he said. "This place, it's as much yours as it is mine now. We're building this life together." His words were a balm to her worries, but the doubt lingered. Would she really be able to adapt to this life? The work was physical, the days long and demanding. She had never imagined herself waking at dawn to tend to crops and livestock. And yet, here she was. That afternoon, as they took a break under the shade of an old oak tree, Emily voiced her fears. "What if I can't do this, Michael? What if I'm not cut out for this life?" Michael took a deep breath, considering her words carefully. "It's not about being perfect at it, Em. It's about wanting it. The rest comes with time." "But what if it doesn't?" she pressed. "What if I fail? What if my father was right?" Michael's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained gentle. "Your father might think he knows what's best for you, but he doesn't know your heart. I do, and I believe in you." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I want to believe in myself too." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "Then start small, one day at a time. You don't have to have it all figured out right now." Emily nodded, the weight on her chest easing just a little. Maybe Michael was right. Maybe she didn't have to have all the answers yet. She just needed to keep moving forward, one step at a time. Meanwhile, back at the Whitmore estate, Richard sat in his office, staring at a stack of paperwork that he hadn't touched in hours. The house was quieter than usual, the absence of Emily like a gaping hole he couldn't ignore. He clenched his fists, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. This was not how things were supposed to go. Emily was supposed to see reason, to understand the importance of duty and legacy. Instead, she had chosen a life of uncertainty and struggle. "She'll come back," he told himself again, but the conviction was weaker this time. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. James, the butler, entered, his expression neutral. "Sir, Mr. Westwood is here for your meeting." Richard's jaw tightened. Daniel Westwood, the man he had deemed worthy of Emily's future. The thought of facing him now, with his carefully laid plans in ruins, was almost unbearable. "Send him in," Richard said, his voice cold. Daniel entered, tall and composed, his handshake firm. "Richard," he greeted. "I was surprised to hear from you after everything." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Emily will come to her senses soon enough," he snapped. "This rebellion of hers is temporary." Daniel's expression remained polite but distant. "Perhaps," he said, "but maybe it's not rebellion. Maybe it's just her way of finding happiness." Richard's jaw clenched, the words hitting a nerve. He dismissed Daniel quickly, unwilling to hear more. As the door closed behind his would-be son-in-law, Richard leaned back in his chair, a gnawing sense of doubt settling in his mind. What if Emily's happiness was something he couldn't control? And worse, what if he was the one who had driven her away from it? The early morning sun bathed the fields in a soft golden light as Emily stood on the front porch of Michael's farmhouse. She hugged her thin sweater tighter around her shoulders, the chill of the morning air still lingering. Everything felt so different here, raw, unfiltered, and real. For the first time in her life, she wasn't surrounded by marble floors, polished furniture, or the echoing silence of her father's mansion. Here, the world was alive with the hum of insects, the rustle of leaves, and the distant clucking of chickens. Michael appeared beside her, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in his hands. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her one. She took the mug gratefully, the warmth seeping into her fingers. "Thank you," she murmured, taking a sip. The coffee was strong, not the meticulously brewed kind she was used to, but it was good, honest, just like everything else here. He leaned on the porch railing, his gaze sweeping over the fields. "It's going to be a busy day," he said. "We've got to finish harvesting the corn before the rain comes this weekend." Emily nodded. Feeling a flutter of nerves, the last few days had been a whirlwind of adjustments. She had traded designer dresses for jeans and work boots, lavish dinners for hearty meals cooked with love, and sterile luxury for the warmth of a real home. It was a lot to take in, but each day, she found herself feeling a little more grounded. "I'll help," she said, trying to sound confident. "I want to pull my weight around here." Michael smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I know you do, and you will. Just don't push yourself too hard, okay? It's a marathon, not a sprint." They walked together to the fields, the grass damp with dew beneath their feet. The rows of corn stretched endlessly, golden and ready for harvest. Michael handed her a pair of gloves and showed her how to properly twist and pull the ears from the stalks. At first, her movements were clumsy. The stalks were tougher than they looked, and the corn heavier. Her arms ached within minutes. But she gritted her teeth and pushed through. Michael worked beside her, his movements fluid and practiced. "You're doing great," he encouraged, glancing over at her with a grin. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her back protested. But hearing his words made the effort feel worth it. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the air grew warm. The scent of earth and corn filled her senses, grounding her in the present moment. She wasn't just watching life happen around her anymore. She was part of it. By midday, they had filled several crates, and Emily collapsed onto the grass, her limbs aching, but her heart light. Michael flopped down beside her, his shirt damp with sweat. She laughed breathlessly. "I had no idea farming was this hard," he chuckled, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Most people don't, but it's honest work. At the end of the day, you can see what you've accomplished." Emily stared up at the sky, a sense of satisfaction washing over her. Back at her father's house, everything had always been handed to her. Here, she had to earn every bit of progress. It felt good, like she was finally shaping her own destiny. They lay in comfortable silence for a while, until Margaret's voice called from the farmhouse. "Lunch is ready." Emily's stomach rumbled in response. They got to their feet, brushing dirt off their clothes, and headed back. The kitchen smelled heavenly. Fresh bread, roasted chicken, and buttery corn on the cob. Margaret had a way of making even the simplest meals feel like a feast as they ate. The conversation flowed easily. Margaret shared stories from Michael's childhood, and they laughed until their sides hurt. It felt like family, something Emily hadn't realized she was missing so desperately. After lunch, Emily helped Margaret with the dishes. The older woman glanced at her thoughtfully. "You know, dear, It takes a lot of courage to leave behind everything you knew. Emily paused, the dish towel in her hand. I guess it does, she admitted softly, but it also feels like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be. Margaret smiled, her eyes warm with understanding. That's what matters. The rest of the afternoon was spent tending to the animals. Emily fed the chickens, collected eggs, and even helped Michael fix a section of the fence that had come loose. Each task, no matter how small, gave her a sense of purpose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Emily and Michael sat on the porch once more. Fireflies blinked in the growing darkness, and the distant croak of frogs filled the air. Michael slid his arm around her shoulders. How are you feeling? Tired, she admitted with a smile. But happy. He kissed her temple softly. We'll get through this together. She leaned into him, the weight of the day's work settling into her bones. I know. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt hope blooming in her heart. This life was hard, yes, but it was also full of love, warmth, and honesty. It was everything she had been searching for, far away. In the cold, empty halls of the Whitmore mansion, Richard sat alone in his study, the silence pressing in on him. His thoughts wandered to Emily, a mixture of anger and confusion swirling inside him. But underneath it all, there was a tiny spark of something he couldn't name: regret. The Whitmore mansion was cloaked in a heavy stillness. Each room seemed to echo with memories that no longer brought comfort. Richard Whitmore sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand. The amber liquid barely touched. The fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth didn't reach him. Shadows danced on the walls, flickering like the doubts he refused to acknowledge. He stared at the empty chair across from him, the one where Emily used to sit during their long discussions about her future. She would listen, sometimes nodding, sometimes arguing, but always present. Now, the emptiness of that chair gnawed at him. He took a slow sip of the whiskey, letting the burn spread through his chest. Pride had always been his armor, his guiding principle. It had built his empire, earned him respect, and, he thought, kept his family in line. But now, that same pride felt like a prison, each bar forged from his own stubbornness. The door creaked open slightly, and James, the butler, stepped inside with his usual quiet composure. "Sir," he said, his voice low, "your meeting with the board is in an hour." Richard nodded but didn't move. The thought of facing the board, discussing quarterly reports, profit margins, and investment portfolios felt hollow. For the first time, his empire felt like an empty shell. "Is there anything else, sir?" James asked, his eyes lingering on his employer a moment longer than usual. Richard hesitated. The words were on the tip of his tongue, but they tasted foreign, bitter. He swallowed them down. "No, James, that will be all." The butler inclined his head and left, the door clicking shut behind him. The silence returned, heavier this time. Richard's eyes drifted to the fireplace mantel where a row of family photos stood. His gaze landed on one in particular, Emily's graduation day. She wore a bright smile, her eyes filled with hope. He remembered that day vividly, the pride swelling in his chest as she walked across the stage. He had envisioned a future for her, a life of security, prestige, and purpose, but she had chosen a different path, one that seemed reckless and naive. A farmer, the word still grated against his pride. What kind of future could she possibly build with someone like that? Yet, as he studied her smile in the photograph, doubt began to creep in. She had looked genuinely happy that day, not because of his expectations, but because she believed in herself. When had he stopped believing in her? He ran a hand through his graying hair, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. The mansion was suffocating him, its grandeur now a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. Meanwhile, in Willow Creek, Emily stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes from dinner. The farmhouse was filled with the soft sounds of evening, crickets chirping outside, the low hum of the radio playing an old country song, and Michael's gentle laughter as he spoke with his mother in the living room. The simple rhythm of this life was becoming familiar, comforting. The ache of her father's rejection was still there, but it was dulled by the love and warmth that surrounded her now. Margaret entered the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "You've taken to this life quicker than I thought," she said with a smile. "I'm proud of you, dear." Emily smiled back, drying her hands on a towel. Thank you. I didn't know if I could do it at first, but it feels right. Margaret's eyes softened. Sometimes, the hardest decisions lead to the best places. Emily's heart swelled with gratitude. Margaret's kindness had been a lifeline, a steady presence that kept her grounded when doubt threatened to pull her under. Have you thought about reaching out to your father? Margaret asked gently. Emily's smile faded. I don't think he'd want to hear from me. Margaret shook her head. Pride is a stubborn thing, but love is stronger. Maybe he's feeling the distance just as much as you are. Emily's fingers tightened around the towel. The idea of calling her father felt like reopening a wound that hadn't yet healed, but a part of her, a small, stubborn part, still missed him, still longed for his approval, his love. I don't know if he'll ever forgive me, she admitted. Forgiveness isn't just for the other person, Margaret said softly. Sometimes it's for yourself, too. The words lingered in Emily's mind as she finished the dishes and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cool, and the sky stretched endlessly above, speckled with stars. Michael joined her a moment later, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Penny for your thoughts, he asked. She leaned into him, her eyes fixed on the horizon. I was just thinking about my father, she confessed. I wonder if he's okay. Michael pressed a kiss to her temple. He's probably wondering the same about you. They stood in silence, the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Emily knew she couldn't change her father. She couldn't force him to understand her choices or to accept the life she had chosen, but she could control how she felt about it. She could choose to forgive, even if he never did. As they stood there, Emily made a silent promise to herself. No matter what happened, she would keep building this life. She would grow, learn, and love, because that was the future she chose. And maybe, one day, her father would choose it too. Back at the mansion, Richard stared out the window at the darkened grounds, his heart heavy with a longing he couldn't shake. Pride had won the battle, but it felt like he was losing the war. He turned away, his reflection in the glass, a stranger he barely recognized. For the first time, Richard Whitmore wondered if his empire was worth the cost of losing his daughter. The days at the Whitmore mansion blurred into one long, cold stretch of time. Richard's routine remained unchanged. Meetings, business calls, formal dinners, but the emptiness gnawed at him. He filled his days with tasks and obligations, but no matter how busy he kept himself, there was a persistent silence that settled into the corners of his life. One gray morning, Richard sat at his desk, a stack of financial reports in front of him. The numbers swam before his eyes. Profit margins, quarterly growth, stock values. It all felt meaningless. He pinched the bridge of his nose, a headache forming behind his eyes. The weight of his decisions, of his own stubborn pride, pressed down on him. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. James, ever punctual, entered the room with a silver tray carrying the morning mail. Your correspondence, sir, he said, setting it down. Thank you, James, Richard muttered, barely looking up. James hesitated for a moment, his gaze lingering on Richard with something almost like pity. Is there anything else you need? Sir, Richard waved him off. No, that will be all. As the door clicked shut, Richard sorted through the letters. Business offers, invitations to events he had no interest in attending. He tossed them aside one by one until his fingers stopped on a cream-colored envelope, smaller and simpler than the others. His heart gave a small, involuntary jolt when he recognized the handwriting. Emily's. He turned the envelope over in his hands, his pulse quickening. He wasn't sure if it was dread, hope, or a painful mixture of both. He debated whether to open it, part of him fearing what she had to say, but curiosity. Or maybe desperation. One out, he carefully slid a letter opener under the flap and unfolded the single sheet of paper. Her handwriting was neat, the words deliberate and unadorned. Dear Father, I hope this letter finds you well. I've thought about writing to you so many times, but I never knew what to say. Even now, I'm not sure if this letter will matter to you, but I need to write it for myself. I want you to know that I'm doing okay. Michael and I are building a life together, and it's not perfect, but it's ours. The work is hard, and some days are more difficult than others, but I've never felt more alive. I've found happiness in the simple things, in the love and support of good people. I don't regret my decision, but that doesn't mean I don't miss you. You were my father long before you were a businessman, and I still carry those memories with me. The times you held my hand when I was scared, the times you told me stories before bed, the moments when I felt like your little girl. I miss those moments, and I miss you. I don't know if you miss me too. Maybe your pride won't let you admit it, but if there's any part of you that wants to understand me, to reconnect, I'm here. My door is always open, even if yours was closed to me. Take care of yourself, love. Emily Richards' hands trembled slightly as he finished the letter. His vision blurred and he blinked rapidly, pushing back the unfamiliar sting of tears. Her words were a mirror, reflecting back the painful truth he had been trying to avoid. You were my father long before you were a businessman. The memories flooded in, Emily's laughter echoing through the halls, her small hand slipping into his when she was afraid of the dark, the way she used to look at him with unconditional trust. He had been her protector, her guide, and now, because of his pride, he was her estranger. He set the letter down carefully, as though it were made of glass. A lump formed in his throat, making it hard to breathe. The armor of pride he had worn for so long felt like it was cracking, the edges cutting into him. He had told himself that she would fail, that she would come back humbled, realizing he had been right all along. But she hadn't failed. She was thriving in a world he didn't understand, a world of simplicity and love, and she had extended an olive branch, even after everything he had done to push her away. Richard leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. The silence of the mansion felt heavier now, almost suffocating. The grandeur of his empire, once a source of pride, now seemed hollow. What was the point of it all if he had lost the one person who truly mattered? He rose from his chair and walked to the window. Outside, the manicured gardens stretched out in perfect symmetry, a testament to control and order. But beyond the iron gates, the world was unpredictable and wild. Like Emily's new life, he wondered what it felt like to wake up with the sun on your face, to work the land with your own hands, to find joy in the simple rhythm of life. It was a world he had always dismissed, but now he found himself craving its raw authenticity. The thought of visiting her farm flickered in his mind, but fear of rejection held him back. Could he really face her after everything? Could he let go of his pride long enough to apologize? A knock on the door startled him out of his thoughts. James entered again, his expression unreadable. "Sir, your car is ready for the meeting." Richard nodded, but his voice felt distant. "Cancel it." James blinked, surprised. "Cancel it, sir." "Yes." Richard's gaze remained fixed on the window. "I have something more important to do." For the first time in years, Richard Whitmore felt like he was taking a step toward something real. And though the path ahead was uncertain, it was one he knew he had to take. Richard Whitmore gripped the steering wheel of his black luxury sedan, his knuckles white. The sleek vehicle felt out of place on the narrow country roads that wound their way toward Willow Creek. Tall trees lined the way, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the morning sunlight. The smell of fresh grass and earth seeped through the vents, a scent that was both unfamiliar and oddly comforting. His heart pounded in his chest, a steady, relentless rhythm that matched the uncertainty swirling in his mind. It had been weeks since Emily's letter arrived, and yet it took him this long to summon the courage to face her. He didn't know what he would say, or if she would even listen, but for the first time in his life, Richard was willing to let go of control and simply try. A sign up ahead announced the entrance to Willow Creek, a small farming community that seemed worlds away from the towering buildings and bustling streets he was used to. The air was cleaner here, the sky a wider shade of blue. He passed fields of golden wheat, neat rows of corn, and small houses with peeling paint but thriving gardens. Everything seemed to hum with life, simplicity, and an honesty he couldn't remember feeling for years. His gaze flicked to a mailbox with the name, Evans, painted on it in faded white letters. His breath caught. This was it. Slowing the car to a crawl, he turned onto the gravel driveway. The tires crunched loudly, shattering the peaceful silence. Richard winced, feeling like an intruder. The farmhouse came into view, a modest, two-story building with a wraparound porch, the kind of place he would have scoffed at before. Now, it looked warm, alive. He parked the car and killed the engine, the silence suddenly deafening. His pulse roared in his ears as he stared at the house, his palms damp with sweat. He was Richard Whitmore, a man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. Yet here he was, trembling like a schoolboy on his first day. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car, the gravel shifting beneath his polished shoes. The farmhouse door swung open, and his breath caught in his throat. Emily stepped out onto the porch. She wore jeans and a plaid shirt, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. The sun kissed her cheeks, giving them a rosy hue. She was holding a basket of freshly picked tomatoes, but when she saw him, the basket slipped from her fingers, the red fruit scattering across the wooden planks. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Her eyes, wide with shock, searched his face as if she couldn't quite believe he was there. "Father," she whispered, the word barely audible. Richard's throat tightened. Seeing her here, in her world, made everything he had been holding on to, his pride, his anger, his need for control, seem absurdly small. He took a tentative step forward. "Hello, Emily," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She blinked, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" He swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the tomatoes strewn across the porch. I wanted to see you, to see how you were." Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of hurt flashing across her face. "After all this time?" He nodded. The weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. "I know I don't deserve to be here. I know I pushed you away. But your letter," his voice cracked, "your letter made me realize how much I've lost. And I needed to try and fix it." She crossed her arms, her posture guarded. "You can't just walk back into my life and expect everything to be okay." "I know," he said quickly. "I don't expect that. He ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find the right words. "I just want to understand, to see the life you've chosen." Emily studied him for a long moment. The silence between them felt fragile, like the slightest wrong word could shatter everything. Finally, she took a deep breath and nodded toward the house. "Come inside," she said quietly. Relief washed over him, so intense it made his knees weak. He followed her up the steps and into the farmhouse. The interior was simple but cozy. The scent of bread baking filled the air, and sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm pools of light on the wooden floor. "This is nice," Richard said awkwardly, feeling out of place in his expensive suit and polished shoes. Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she led him to the kitchen table and gestured for him to sit. She poured 2 cups of coffee, placing one in front of him before sitting down herself. He wrapped his hands around the mug, the warmth seeping into his fingers. It felt grounding, real. "Thank you." They sat in silence for a moment, the tension between them like a taut wire. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice low. "You look happy here." Emily's gaze softened, but her guard remained up. "I am," he nodded, staring into his coffee. I thought you'd fail, that you'd come back and realize I was right." Her jaw tightened. "But I didn't fail, Father. I found something here that I never had at home. Love, purpose, freedom." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I was wrong to think that money and control were the only things that mattered. I let my pride get in the way of seeing you for who you are." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Why now? Why did it take you so long to realize that?" "Because I was afraid," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Afraid of losing control. Afraid of being wrong, but losing you. That fear is worse than any other." The room was silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Emily took a shaky breath. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet. I understand," he said softly. "But I'm here, and I'll keep trying if you'll let me." She looked at him, searching his face for sincerity. After a long pause, she nodded. "One step at a time." Richard's heart swelled with fragile hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to mend what had been broken. The air inside the farmhouse felt dense with unspoken words. Richard sat at the kitchen table, his fingers wrapped around the coffee cup, the warmth barely seeping into his cold hands. Across from him, Emily's gaze flickered between cautious and conflicted, her eyes shadowed by memories of pain and rejection. The creaking of the wooden floorboards seemed louder in the silence, a reminder that this wasn't his world. Richard cleared his throat, the sound jarring in the quiet room. "This place," he began, his voice hesitant. "It's different from what I imagined. Emily's fingers traced the rim of her cup. You mean it's not a crumbling shack in the middle of nowhere? Her voice was tinged with bitterness. He winced, the sting of her words cutting deeper than he expected. I was wrong to think that, to think so little of your choices. She let out a sharp breath, the frustration bubbling to the surface. You didn't just think little of them. You thought nothing of them. You believed that because Michael didn't come from money, he wasn't good enough. That because I chose a simpler life, I was throwing everything away. Richard's jaw tightened, his shame pressing down on him like a physical weight. I thought I was protecting you, he admitted. I thought that if you followed the path I laid out, you'd be safe, that you'd have everything you needed. Emily's eyes flared with emotion. But you never asked me what I needed, did you? You decided for me. You controlled every aspect of my life until I couldn't breathe anymore. Her words pierced him, each one a reflection of his failures. He looked down at his hands, the knuckles white from his grip on the cup. I thought I was doing the right thing, he said quietly. I thought love meant making sure you didn't struggle. Sometimes love means letting go, Emily said, her voice softening. Letting me make my own choices, even if they aren't the ones you would make. He nodded, his throat tight. I see that now. I see how much I've hurt you. The door creaked open, and Michael stepped in, his boots leaving faint prints of dirt on the floor. He paused, taking in the scene, the tension hanging between Emily and her father. His eyes met Emily's, and for a moment, everything felt anchored again. Hey, Michael said gently. Everything okay? Emily nodded slowly. We're just talking. Michael's gaze shifted to Richard, cautious but not hostile. Mr. Whitmore? Richard stood up, feeling out of place, and painfully aware of the chasm between him and this man who his daughter loved. He extended his hand, his voice steady but strained. Michael. Michael hesitated just a moment before shaking Richard's hand. His grip was firm, the handshake brief but significant. They both sat down, the air thick with unspoken questions. Richard cleared his throat. I owe you an apology. Michael, I judged you without knowing you, without understanding what kind of man you are. Michael nodded, his eyes calm but watchful. Emily's happiness is what matters to me. I don't need your approval, but I respect that you're here. Richard swallowed, the humility of Michael's words a bitter pill to take. Thank you for taking care of her. Emily looked between them, her heart tight in her chest. This was the conversation she had hoped for, but it still felt raw and fragile, like it could crumble at any moment. Michael leaned back in his chair, his tone gentle. Emily's stronger than you give her credit for. She didn't need saving. She just needed someone to believe in her. Richard nodded, his eyes glistening with a hint of moisture. I realize that now, and I regret that it took me so long to see it. The room fell into silence again, the weight of years of misunderstandings pressing down on them. Emily took a slow breath, her voice barely above a whisper. It's going to take time, Dad. I can't just forget everything that happened. Richard nodded, his voice thick. I don't expect you to, but if you'll let me, I want to try to make things right, to learn from you and Michael, to understand the life you've chosen. Michael glanced at Emily, silently asking if she was okay with this. She gave a small nod, her eyes shimmering with uncertainty and hope. We can try, she said softly, but it has to be on my terms. Richard's heart ached with the understanding that this was a new beginning, not one he controlled, but one he was grateful to be part of. I understand. I want to be in your life again, Emily. She looked at him, her walls still up, but with a small door cracked open. We'll see how it goes, she said, her voice hesitant but not unkind. One step at a time. He managed a faint smile. I'll take whatever steps you're willing to give me. The tension in the room ebbed slightly, the sharp edges of pain and regret, softening into something that resembled hope. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a beginning, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. As they sat in the quiet of the farmhouse, the wind rustled through the trees outside, carrying with it the scent of new growth. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a flicker of something he had almost forgotten. Possibility. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the fields. Emily stood by the kitchen window, her fingers wrapped around a glass of iced tea, condensation trickling down onto her hand. Outside, Michael was busy mending a fence, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up to his elbows, his movements sure and steady. It was a scene she had grown used to, a rhythm she now understood. But today, a new element disrupted the fragile peace of her world. Her father, Richard, was seated on the porch, his suit jacket draped over the back of the chair, his dress shirt rolled up in an awkward attempt at casualness. His eyes surveyed the farmland, his gaze lingering on the neat rows of crops, the chickens scratching the dirt, and the windmill creaking gently in the breeze. It was clear he was trying to process it all, to reconcile the simplicity of this life with the daughter he had once molded to fit his vision of success. Emily let out a soft sigh. This felt like walking a tightrope stretched over a chasm of old wounds and unresolved pain. One wrong word, one misstep, and everything could fall apart. She had agreed to let him stay for the afternoon, to show him a glimpse of the world she had chosen, but she wasn't sure if it would help them rebuild, or only widen the gulf between them. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and took a deep breath. One step at a time, she reminded herself. Stepping out onto the porch, she handed her father a glass of iced tea. "Here," she said, her voice soft. "It's hot out." Richard looked up, surprise flickering across his face before he accepted the glass. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and careful. He took a sip, the cold liquid a relief against the warmth of the day. He looked at Emily, a hint of hesitation in his eyes. "This place, it's peaceful." She nodded, leaning against the railing. "It is. That's one of the things I love about it." He stared out at the fields again, his brow furrowed. "I didn't think you'd choose a life like this," he admitted. "It's so different from how you grew up." Emily's jaw tightened. "That's exactly why I chose it. I wanted something real, something I could build with my own hands." He nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "I can see that now. I thought I was protecting you, but maybe I was just protecting my own ideas of what your life should be." A long silence stretched between them, filled only with the sound of the wind rustling the leaves and the distant clink of Michael's tools. Emily felt the weight of his words, a mixture of relief and sadness swirling inside her. "It wasn't your life to control, Dad," she said softly. "I needed to figure things out for myself." He looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I know that now, but knowing it doesn't erase the mistakes I made, the things I said." Emily swallowed hard. The memory of that final argument flashing through her mind, the coldness in his voice, the way he had turned his back on her. The hurt was still there, buried, but not forgotten. "I don't know if things can ever go back to the way they were," she admitted. "Too much has happened." Richard nodded, the lines on his face deepening. "I'm not asking for things to go back. I'm just asking for a chance to move forward in whatever way you'll allow." She studied him, searching for sincerity in his eyes. For the first time, she saw more than just the stern, unyielding businessman. She saw a man who was lost, who had realized too late what his pride had cost him. The sight chipped away at the walls she had built around her heart. "Moving forward means you have to let go of your expectations," she said. "You can't just accept this life because you think it's a phase or a mistake I'll outgrow." "I don't think that anymore," he said quietly. "I see now that you've built something meaningful here, something I didn't understand because I was too blinded by my own fears." She exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little. "Then maybe we can start with that." A faint smile touched his lips, cautious and uncertain. "I'd like that." Just then, Michael walked up to the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. He nodded politely at Richard. "Everything okay here?" Emily glanced at her father, and then back at Michael. "I think so," she said, her voice steady. "We're figuring it out." Michael's eyes softened, understanding passing between them. "Good." He turned to Richard. "I'm going to check on the horses. You're welcome to come along if you'd like." Richard hesitated, the idea clearly unfamiliar, but after a moment he nodded. "All right." Emily watched as the two men walked toward the barn, their steps tentative, the distance between them a reflection of the distance they still had to bridge. But the fact that her father was trying, that he was willing to step into her world, even if it was awkward and uncomfortable, meant more than she had words for. She took a deep breath, the air cool against her flushed cheeks. This wasn't the perfect reconciliation she had dreamed of, but maybe perfection wasn't the point. Maybe healing was messy, filled with small steps forward and the occasional stumble, And maybe that was okay. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the fields, Emily felt a flicker of hope. A fragile bridge was being built, not out of grand gestures or sweeping apologies, but out of small, earnest attempts to understand each other, and for now, that was enough. The barn smelled of hay, wood, and earth, an oddly soothing mix. Richard stepped inside, his polished shoes awkward against the rough wooden floor. Sunlight streamed through the open doors, catching particles of dust in golden beams. The gentle snorts of the horses and the soft creaking of leather tack filled the quiet space. Michael was already at work, moving with practiced ease. He stroked the muzzle of a chestnut mare, whispering something to calm her before he began brushing her coat. Richard watched, unsure of how to fit into this world, a place that felt so far removed from his own. "You can give me a hand if you want," Michael said without looking up. His tone was polite, but there was an edge of challenge to it. Richard hesitated. He'd spent his life in boardrooms and penthouse offices. He had no experience with animals beyond betting on racehorses. Still, he nodded stiffly. "What do you need me to do?" Michael glanced at him, a faint smile flickering across his face. "Start simple." He handed Richard a brush. "You can help groom her." Richard took the brush, feeling the rough wooden handle in his hand. He stepped toward the horse cautiously, the sheer size of the animal making his heart beat faster. The mare's dark eyes studied him with what he imagined was quiet judgment. Michael chuckled. "She's not going to bite. Just move gently, and she'll trust you." Richard nodded, exhaling slowly. He raised the brush and began to run it along the mare's side. His movements tentative and unsure. The horse flicked her ears but didn't shy away. He continued, the repetitive motion of brushing oddly therapeutic as he worked. Michael spoke quietly. "Emily told me a lot about you when we first met. How driven you were. How much you built from nothing." Richard's jaw tightened. "I thought I was building something for her too." "I know," Michael said. "But what you built was your vision of what her life should be, not hers." Richard paused, the brush stilling in his hand. "I wanted her to have stability, security." Michael leaned against the stall, his expression thoughtful. "I get that, but sometimes security feels like a cage. Emily needed freedom more than anything else." Richard's shoulders sagged. He felt the truth of those words, and it stung. "I didn't see that. I thought freedom meant recklessness." "Maybe it does sometimes," Michael admitted. "But for Emily, it meant finding out who she was on her own terms." Richard resumed brushing, his movements steadier now. "You love her," he said, not as a question but a statement. "I do," Michael said simply, "and I respect her. That's the foundation of everything we've built here." Richard swallowed hard. Respect. He had always believed respect was earned, demanded, or bought. But maybe he had forgotten how to give it freely, to his daughter, to her choices, and to the man she had chosen. "I'm sorry," Richard said quietly. The words felt strange in his mouth, like they had been buried for years and were finally clawing their way out. "I misjudged you, and I misjudged her." Michael nodded. "Apology accepted, but it's not me you need to fix things with." Richard's gaze dropped to the ground. "I know. I just don't know if she'll ever forgive me." Michael's eyes softened. "She wants to, but forgiveness takes time, and it takes proof. You have to show her you're willing to change." Richard let out a long breath, his grip on the brush loosening. "I'm trying. That's a good start." They finished grooming the mare in companionable silence. Richard's movements became more confident, the foreign task becoming a little less intimidating. When they were done, Michael gave the horse a pat on the neck and led her back to the pasture. As they stepped outside, the late afternoon sun warmed Richard's face. Emily was waiting by the fence, watching them with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The breeze tugged at her hair, the golden light turning her silhouette into something almost ethereal. Michael gave Richard a small nod and walked away, leaving them alone. Emily tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Did you survive the barn?" Richard chuckled softly. "Barely. I think the horse had more patience with me than I deserved." She laughed, a genuine sound that eased the knot in his chest. "Horses are good judges of character." He looked at her, his eyes shadowed with regret. "I hope that means there's still hope for me." Emily's smile faded, replaced by a serious expression. "There's always hope, Dad. But it has to come from you. He nodded, his throat tight. I'm ready to try. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand this life, but I want to understand you. Her eyes shimmered with emotion, and for a moment, the years of distance and hurt seemed to shrink just a little. That's all I ever wanted. They stood there together, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the fields. Richard felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Humility. The realization that he didn't have all the answers, that he didn't have control over everything, was both terrifying and liberating. Do you want to stay for dinner? Emily asked hesitantly. He smiled, the expression softer than she had seen in years. I'd like that. They walked back to the farmhouse side by side, the space between them narrowing with each step. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a beginning, a fragile bridge built on tentative understanding, respect, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. The kitchen was filled with the comforting sounds of home, the sizzle of onions frying, the clink of utensils, and the low hum of conversation. Emily stirred a pot of stew, the rich aroma of herbs and vegetables filling the air. Her father sat at the kitchen table, his hands folded, eyes observing everything but not quite sure where he belonged in the scene. It felt strange to have him here, in this space that had become her sanctuary. She had spent years imagining what it would be like to reconcile with him, but now that he was sitting just feet away, the distance between them still felt vast. Margaret entered the room, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her smile was warm but cautious. Dinner smells wonderful, Emily. Thanks, Margaret, Emily replied softly. She glanced over at Richard. Dad, do you want to help with something? We're almost ready to set the table. Richard's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but he nodded. Of course. Just tell me what to do. Emily gestured to the cabinet. Plates and silverware are over there. He stood and walked to the cabinet, opening it with hesitant hands. The plates were mismatched, some with chips along the edges, a stark contrast to the fine china of the Whitmore mansion. He carefully stacked them, the clinking sound sharp in the quiet. Margaret watched him for a moment before breaking the silence. Thank you for helping, Mr. Whitmore. He nodded, his voice gruff. It's the least I can do. As he set the plates on the table, the simple, mundane task grounded him in a way he hadn't expected. The weight of the porcelain, the symmetry of the settings, it all felt real, like he was contributing to something more than just an empty routine. Michael entered the room, carrying a basket of freshly baked bread. He gave Richard a polite nod, then kissed Emily on the cheek. Smells amazing, babe. Emily smiled, the warmth of his presence steadying her nerves. Thanks. I hope it tastes as good as it smells. They all took their seats around the table, a quiet awkwardness settling over them. The contrast between this simple farmhouse meal and the lavish dinners Richard was used to was jarring, but there was something here. A warmth. A sincerity that those opulent meals had never offered. Margaret folded her hands, her voice gentle. Shall we say grace? Everyone bowed their heads. Richard hesitated, not accustomed to such traditions, but he followed suit. Margaret's voice was soft and steady. Thank you for this meal, for the hands that prepared it, and for the company around this table. May we find peace, understanding, and the strength to forgive. Richard's throat tightened. The words felt personal, like they were meant just for him. When he lifted his head, his eyes met Emily's. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away, her expression unreadable. They began to eat, the clink of silverware the only sound at first. The stew was hearty and flavorful, the kind of meal that warmed from the inside out. Richard took a bite and nodded appreciatively. This is good, he said quietly. Thank you, Emily replied, her voice soft. The conversation started tentatively, like dipping toes into cold water. Michael talked about the upcoming harvest. Margaret shared a story about a stubborn cow that had gotten loose last week, and Emily listened, adding small comments here and there. Richard found himself watching them all, realizing how much life he had missed by clinging to his pride. He cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. Emily, I never asked. How did you learn to cook like this? She paused, her spoon halfway to her mouth. Margaret taught me, she said. When I first got here, I didn't know how to do much of anything. I had to learn everything from scratch. He nodded. the sting of her words settling deep. "I should have taught you more about life. Real life. You taught me other things," she said, her tone neutral. "Just not the things I needed." The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. It was the silence of truth, of wounds acknowledged. Michael shifted slightly, his eyes steady on Richard. "It's never too late to learn," he said quietly. Richard looked at Michael, surprised by the offer hidden in those words. He nodded slowly. "I'm willing to try." Margaret smiled faintly. "That's all anyone can ask." They finished the meal, the conversation easing into a gentler rhythm. Richard helped clear the table, his movements awkward but sincere. As they washed the dishes together, Emily handed him a towel to dry. Their hands brushed briefly, and she didn't pull away. "Thank you for coming today," she said, her voice low. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "Thank you for letting me." A long pause stretched between them, the air thick with unspoken words. Emily took a breath. "This doesn't mean everything's okay," she said, "but it's a start." He swallowed hard, his voice rough. "That's all I'm asking for, a chance to start again." She gave a small nod, her eyes glimmering with something that might have been hope. "We'll take it one day at a time," Richard nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He didn't know how long it would take to rebuild what had been broken, but for the first time, he was willing to do the work. As the last dish was dried and put away, he looked around the farmhouse kitchen, the place where his daughter had found herself, where love and respect thrived. It was a world he was still learning to understand, but it was a world he wanted to be part of. When he stepped outside, the cool night air wrapped around him. Stars sparkled in the sky, unpolluted by city lights. For the first time in years, Richard felt a flicker of peace, like he was no longer standing on the outside looking in. It wasn't a perfect bridge they were building, but it was real, and that was enough. The morning sun filtered through the farmhouse curtains, casting warm patches of light on the worn wooden floor. Richard sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that Margaret had handed him. He hadn't slept well, his mind racing through memories and regrets. But the quiet of the house soothed him in a way he hadn't expected. The smell of bacon and eggs filled the air, and the soft sound of pans clinking together added a rhythm to the morning. Emily moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, flipping eggs and plating toast. Richard watched her, a pang of realization hitting him. She had grown into a capable, confident woman, despite his attempts to shape her life differently. He cleared his throat, trying to find his voice. "Can I help with anything?" Emily glanced at him, surprise flickering across her face before she nodded toward the fridge. "Could you get the butter?" "Of course." He stood, his movement stiff but determined, opening the fridge. He found the butter and set it on the counter. It was a simple task, but it felt like progress. Margaret smiled as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "It's nice to see a man in the kitchen." "Richard, you're getting the hang of farm life." He gave a small, sheepish smile. "I'm trying." Michael entered the room, his hair tousled from sleep. He kissed Emily on the forehead and took a seat. "Morning, everyone." "Morning," Emily replied, handing him a plate of eggs and toast. Richard sat back down, the warmth of the kitchen wrapping around him. They ate together, conversation flowing in fits and starts. Michael talked about the tasks ahead for the day, repairing a fence line, checking the irrigation system, and hauling a load of hay. Richard listened, trying to absorb the details of a life so different from his own. After breakfast, Michael pushed back his chair. "I need to head out to the fields. There's a lot to get done today." Richard hesitated, then spoke up. "I'd like to help." Michael raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Richard nodded. "I need to learn what this life is like. I want to understand." A smile tugged at the corner of Michael's mouth. "All right then, let's get you some work boots." Richard followed Michael to the barn, where a spare pair of boots waited by the door. He exchanged his polished dress shoes for the scuffed, dusty boots. Feeling like he was shedding a part of his old identity, they fit snugly, grounding him in the reality of the day ahead. They walked out to the field, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The air smelled of fresh grass and damp earth. Richard took a deep breath, the simplicity of the moment settling into his bones. Michael handed him a pair of work gloves. "We're fixing the east fence line. Some posts got knocked loose during the last storm." Richard pulled on the gloves, the rough fabric unfamiliar against his skin. Sounds straightforward. Michael chuckled. You'd be surprised. Let's get to it. They worked side by side, the heat of the sun pressing down on them. Richard's hands ached from gripping the hammer, and sweat dripped down his back, staining his shirt. Each swing of the hammer was a reminder of how far he was from the world he had always known. And yet, there was a strange satisfaction in the work, in the rhythmic motion of driving nails and securing boards. As they finished one section of the fence, Michael wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. You're doing all right, Mr. Whitmore. Richard let out a breathless laugh. Call me Richard. I think we've earned that much. Michael nodded, a genuine smile breaking across his face. Richard, then. They moved to the next section, the quiet between them no longer tense. Birds called from the trees, and the distant hum of a tractor drifted on the breeze. Richard found himself appreciating the simplicity of the moment. There were no boardrooms here, no power plays, no stock market fluctuations, just the earth, the tools in his hands, and the sense of purpose that came from building something tangible. As they worked, Richard's thoughts drifted back to Emily. He had spent so long trying to force her into the mold of his expectations, never realizing that she had found her own version of success, a version that didn't come with skyscrapers or boardroom tables, but was just as valid, just as worthy. Michael's voice broke through his thoughts. You know, Emily never wanted to shut you out completely. Richard nodded slowly, his chest tightening. I know that now, and I know I made it impossible for her to stay. Michael leaned on the fence post, his gaze thoughtful. She wanted your approval, but when she couldn't get it, she had to choose herself. I hope you understand that. I do, Richard said quietly, and I wish I had understood it sooner. They finished the last section of the fence as the sun reached its peak. Richard's muscles ached. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and his hands throbbed. But there was a sense of accomplishment that settled deep in his bones. Michael clapped him on the shoulder. Not bad for your first day. Richard chuckled. I'm not sure I'll be able to move tomorrow. They walked back toward the farmhouse, the smell of lunch wafting through the air. Emily was on the porch, her eyes widening slightly when she saw the dirt on Richard's clothes and the sweat on his brow. You survived, she said, a teasing smile on her lips. Barely, he replied, returning her smile. Something shifted between them in that moment. A recognition, a shared understanding that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just a visitor now. He was someone trying, someone willing to learn. Come wash up, she said, her voice softening. Lunch is ready. Richard followed her inside, the fragile bridge between them growing a little stronger, a little more real. For the first time in years, he felt like he was moving toward something worth having. And for now, that was enough. The afternoon sun filtered through the farmhouse windows, casting soft shadows along the kitchen floor. Richard sat at the table, freshly cleaned up and wearing a simple, borrowed shirt that felt strange against his skin. The ache in his muscles from the morning's work was a constant reminder that this world operated on different rules than the one he knew. And yet, there was a part of him that welcomed the discomfort, a reminder that growth never came without pain. Emily and Margaret moved around the kitchen, the clink of dishes and the low hum of conversation filling the space. Michael leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the scene with a contented smile. Richard took it all in, trying to reconcile this peaceful moment with the chaos he felt inside. Lunch was a simple spread of roast chicken, garden vegetables, and fresh bread. As they gathered around the table, Richard felt a sense of awkwardness settle over him. He wasn't sure how he fit into this picture, or if he even belonged here at all, but he was determined to try. Margaret offered a warm smile as she handed him a bowl of potatoes. Don't be shy. We believe in good food and full plates here. He chuckled softly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little. Thank you, Margaret. I'm not used to such hospitality. Emily glanced at him, her eyes unreadable. Maybe it's time you got used to it. Her words were gentle, but they carried a weight that pressed down on him. Richard nodded, his voice quiet. I'd like that. They ate in relative silence, the clink of forks against plates filling the spaces where words seemed too difficult to find. Richard took a bite of the roast chicken, the flavors rich and satisfying. It wasn't a 5-star meal prepared by a chef, but it was nourishing in a way he hadn't experienced in years. As the meal wound down, Michael pushed his chair back and stood. I've got to finish hauling the hay before it gets too late. Richard, You're welcome to join me if you feel up to it. Richard's instinct was to decline, to retreat back into his comfort zone, but he caught Emily's gaze, a flicker of hope and hesitation dancing in her eyes. He swallowed his pride and nodded. I'll help. Michael grinned. I'll meet you by the barn in 10 minutes. When he left, Emily began to clear the table, stacking plates with practiced efficiency. Richard hesitated, then stood and reached for a stack of dishes. Let me help. Emily looked surprised, but she handed him the plates. They worked side by side, the silence between them filled with unspoken thoughts. Richard washed while Emily dried, their movements cautious but synchronized. It was a small thing, but it felt like progress. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice low. I regret so many things, Emily, but what I regret most is that I let my pride come between us. She paused, her hand stilling on a dish. I know you thought you were doing the right thing, but your pride made me feel like I was never enough, unless I followed the path you chose for me. His throat tightened. That was never my intention. I know, she said softly, but it was still the result. Richard nodded, the truth of her words settling into his heart. I'm trying to change that, to let go of the control I've held onto for so long. Emily studied him for a moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. Change takes time, Dad, and trust takes even longer. I'm willing to give it as much time as you need, he replied. I just want to be part of your life again, in whatever way you'll allow. She let out a breath, the tension in her shoulders loosening just a bit. Let's just keep taking it one step at a time. He nodded, grateful for even the smallest opening. One step at a time. They finished the dishes, and Richard dried his hands on a worn kitchen towel. I should go help Michael. Emily nodded, her smile small but genuine. Be careful out there. The hay bales are heavier than they look. He chuckled. I'll do my best. As he stepped outside, the sunlight felt brighter, the air clearer. He made his way to the barn where Michael was already loading bales of hay onto the back of a flatbed truck. Michael looked up, a grin spreading across his face. Ready for round 2. Richard smiled back, the ache in his muscles a dull reminder of his morning's efforts. I'm ready. They worked together, the physical labor grounding Richard in a way that no amount of wealth or success ever had. He hefted hay bales, the dry strands scratching at his skin, the weight testing his limits. But each lift, each push, each moment spent working the land, chipped away at the barriers he had built around himself. Sweat dripped down his face, his shirt clinging to his back. His breath came in heavy bursts, but he kept going. The simplicity of the work, the straightforward nature of the task, gave his mind a reprieve from the chaos of his thoughts. For the first time in years, he wasn't calculating, strategizing, or planning. He was just being. When the last bale was loaded, Richard leaned against the truck, his chest heaving. Michael clapped him on the back. Not bad for a city guy. Richard laughed, the sound rusty but real. I'll take that as a compliment. They drove the truck to the storage barn, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon. As they unloaded the bales, Richard felt a sense of accomplishment settle deep within him. It was a small thing, but it was real. When they finished, they walked back toward the farmhouse, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. Richard's body ached, but his heart felt lighter. For the first time, he understood a small piece of Emily's world, a world built on hard work, love, and resilience. As the farmhouse came into view, Emily was on the porch, watching them approach. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, Richard saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Possibility. The twilight sky stretched above the farmhouse, fading from warm orange to deep indigo. Crickets chirped in the distance, and the faint rustling of leaves whispered on the breeze. Richard stood at the edge of the porch, his muscles aching from the day's work, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. Emily sat on the steps, her arms wrapped around her knees. The glow from the farmhouse window cast a soft light on her face, highlighting the subtle lines of worry and resilience. They hadn't spoken much since the day's labor ended, but the silence between them wasn't hostile. It was the kind of quiet that felt like fertile ground, where understanding might take root. Richard cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. Thank you for letting me stay today. I know it's not easy having me here. Emily's eyes lifted to meet his, a flicker of vulnerability behind them. It's not easy. No, but it's not impossible either. Her words hung in the air, delicate but strong. Richard nodded, his voice low. I'm starting to understand that. He took a deep breath, his hands gripping the porch railing. The night air filled his lungs, cool and cleansing. You've built something real here, Emily. Something I never took the time to see. She turned her gaze back toward the fields, the dark outlines of the crops swaying gently. It's not much by your standards. I'm sure. He shook his head. It's everything I never realized I wanted for you. Happiness, purpose, love. He paused, his voice catching. I thought I was protecting you by keeping you close, by making sure you followed a path I understood, but all I did was drive you away. Emily's fingers tightened around her knees. You didn't just drive me away. You made me feel like my choices didn't matter, like I didn't matter. Richard's chest tightened, the guilt sharp and unforgiving. I was wrong. I see that now, and I know words aren't enough to fix it. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging as if releasing a weight she had carried for too long. It's not about fixing it, Dad. It's about trying, about showing up and respecting the life I chose. I want to try, he said, his voice earnest. I want to understand your world, to be part of it in whatever way you'll let me. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, as if searching for cracks in his resolve. What she found must have been enough because she nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Then let's start with something simple. Richard arched a brow, curiosity flickering in his eyes. What do you have in mind? She stood, brushing the dust from her jeans. Come with me. He followed her off the porch, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. They walked past the barn, the scent of hay and earth thick in the air. The world was quiet, the kind of peaceful stillness that city life never offered. Richard felt a strange sense of calm settle over him, the tension in his shoulders loosening with every step. They stopped at the edge of the pasture. A few horses grazed under the moonlight, their silhouettes dark against the night sky. Emily leaned against the wooden fence, her fingers curling around the rough wood. This is where I come when I need to think, she said softly. When everything feels too heavy. Richard nodded, his gaze drifting over the field. I used to have places like that before. Everything got so complicated. Maybe it's time to find them again, she said, her voice gentle. He looked at her, the moon casting a glow on her face. Maybe it is. She let out a breath and turned to face him. I want you to meet someone. Richard frowned slightly as she opened the gate and stepped inside the pasture. A sleek black horse lifted its head, ears pricking forward. Emily clicked her tongue softly, and the horse trotted over, its mane glinting in the moonlight. This is Shadow, she said, running a hand down the horse's strong neck. He was wild when we got him. Took a lot of time and patience to earn his trust. Richard watched the animal, its dark eyes calm and steady. He's beautiful, Emily smiled, a warmth in her expression that softened the edges of her guarded heart. He taught me a lot about patience, about not giving up, even when it feels like progress is impossible. She took Richard's hand, the gesture so unexpected that his breath caught. She guided his palm to Shadow's muzzle. The horse sniffed cautiously, then allowed the touch, its warm breath tickling Richard's fingers. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. I think he likes me. Emily's eyes glistened. Trust isn't easy to earn, but once you have it, it's worth everything. He nodded, the weight of her words sinking deep. I hope I can earn yours again. She looked at him, the walls she had built beginning to show cracks. You're on the right path. They stood together, the night wrapping around them, the simple act of trust between father, daughter, and horse, weaving a delicate thread of connection. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was real, and for now, that was enough. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Richard felt something shift inside him, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild what he had broken, one step at a time. The morning sun bathed the farmhouse in a golden glow, warming the wooden floorboards and filtering through the thin curtains. Emily sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee, the warmth of the mug grounding her. Across from her, Richard sat in an unfamiliar pair of jeans and a simple button-down shirt. He looked out of place, but somehow, he also looked more real than he ever had. It had been a week since Richard's unexpected visit, and though each day brought its share of awkwardness, there was also a tentative sense of progress. He was trying, and for now, that was enough. Margaret bustled around the kitchen, frying eggs and slicing bread. Michael leaned against the counter, his easy smile a comfort in the quiet of the morning. The sounds of life and routine filled the space, a gentle rhythm that Richard was starting to appreciate. "Dad," Emily said softly, breaking the silence, "we're heading into town today. There's a local fair, and we usually sell some produce and baked goods there. You're welcome to come." Richard looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "A fair?" Emily shrugged. "It's nothing fancy, just local farmers, families, and a few vendors, but it's part of our life here." He considered her offer, his instinct to decline warring with his desire to connect. Finally, he nodded. "I'd like to go." A small smile lifted the corners of Emily's mouth. "Great, we leave in an hour." The drive into town was short but scenic. The narrow roads wound through rolling fields of wildflowers, their colors bursting against the green. Richard sat in the passenger seat of Michael's old truck, the engine rumbling beneath them. Emily rode in the middle, her presence a bridge between the two men. As they pulled into the town square, Richard's eyes widened. The fair was a lively scene of brightly colored tents, hand-painted signs, and bustling crowds. Children ran past with sticky fingers and faces painted like tigers. The air smelled of fresh popcorn, roasted corn, and the sweetness of cotton candy. "This is more than I expected," Richard admitted, his voice tinged with wonder. Emily chuckled. "It's simple, but it's ours." They parked and unloaded crates of fresh vegetables and loaves of homemade bread. Richard insisted on helping, lifting the crates with a determination that made Michael grin. "You're getting the hang of this," Michael teased. Richard let out a breath, wiping his forehead. "It's good to feel useful." They set up the stand quickly, the table draped with a simple checkered cloth. The display was modest, but it was honest, a reflection of the life Emily had chosen. As the fair opened, people began to wander by, some stopping to chat with Emily and Michael, exchanging smiles and handshakes. Richard stood back at first, watching the interactions. The warmth and familiarity between everyone here were a stark contrast to the cold, transactional exchanges of his own world. There was no pretense, no power plays, just genuine connection. An older woman with silver hair and bright eyes stopped at the stand, picking up a loaf of bread and turning to Emily. "Your baking just keeps getting better, dear." "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," Emily replied with a smile. "Margaret's the real master. I just follow her lead." Mrs. Thompson's gaze shifted to Richard, curiosity lighting her eyes. "And who's this?" Emily hesitated, then glanced at her father. "This is my dad. He's visiting." Richard stepped forward, offering a handshake. "Richard Whitmore, it's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Thompson's grip was firm. "Well, it's nice to see a new face around here, and it's even nicer to see a family trying to find its way back together." Richard's throat tightened. "I'm trying." She patted his hand with a knowing smile. "That's all that matters." As she walked away, Richard let out a shaky breath. He turned to Emily, his voice low. "She knew, just by looking at us." Emily nodded. "People here pay attention. They see what matters." They fell into a rhythm, helping customers, answering questions, and sharing stories about the farm. Richard's shoulders loosened, his usual guarded demeanor slipping away. For the first time in years, he felt like part of something instead of standing outside looking in. As the afternoon waned, Michael leaned close to Emily, his voice soft. "He's doing good." She nodded, her heart swelling with cautious hope. "Yeah, he is." Richard caught her gaze, and for a moment, they shared a look of understanding. The walls between them were still there, but they were thinner now, more like veils than barriers. Later, as they packed up the stand, the sun dipping low in the sky, Richard felt a strange mix of exhaustion and peace. The day had been long, but it had also been healing in ways he hadn't expected. As they loaded the last crate into the truck, he turned to Emily. "Thank you for today." She studied him for a moment, her eyes soft. "Thank you for coming." They climbed into the truck, the ride back filled with the quiet comfort of shared experience. The fields rolled by, bathed in golden light, and Richard felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, belonging, when they pulled up to the farmhouse. Richard hesitated before getting out. "Emily," he said, his voice unsure. "I know there's still a lot to mend between us, but I hope today was a step in the right direction." She looked at him, the corners of her mouth lifting. It was. As they walked toward the house, side by side, the air between them felt different. The wounds of the past hadn't healed completely, but they were no longer festering. There was light now, filtering through the cracks, showing them a path forward. And for the first time, Richard allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could walk that path together. The morning light poured over the fields, casting long shadows as the sun began its ascent. The scent of dew-drenched grass and blooming wildflowers filled the crisp air. Emily stood at the edge of the farmhouse porch, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands. The past weeks had felt like a long, delicate dance. Steps forward, hesitant pauses, and moments of painful clarity. Yet, here they were, still trying. Richard emerged from the house, his own coffee cup in hand. His steps were slower now, less rigid. He wore the same borrowed jeans and shirt from his first day here, the formality of his old wardrobe left behind like a discarded shell. He joined Emily on the porch, standing quietly beside her. For a moment, they simply watched the sun climb higher over the horizon, the fields glowing with promise. Richard took a sip of his coffee, the warmth spreading through him. He hadn't realized how much he had missed moments like these. Simple, unhurried, shared. "Another beautiful morning," he said, his voice low. Emily nodded, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. "It always is out here. You just have to take the time to notice." He let her words sink in. "I'm finally starting to..." The screen door creaked, and Michael stepped out, stretching his arms with a satisfied yawn. "Morning, you two," he greeted, his voice still rough with sleep. "Morning," they replied in unison. Michael grinned and kissed Emily on the temple. "The fence looks good. Thanks for helping out yesterday." Richard nodded, a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years blooming in his chest. "Happy to help." Michael glanced at Emily. "I'm going to head out and check on the irrigation system. I'll see you in a bit." She nodded, squeezing his hand. "Be careful." Michael waved and walked toward the barn, leaving Emily and Richard in the quiet again. The breeze ruffled the leaves on the old oak tree by the fence line, the branches swaying gently. Emily turned to her father, her gaze steady. "You know, a few weeks ago, I didn't think this would be possible." Richard swallowed, his throat tight. "Neither did I." She took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I'm still scared, Dad. I'm scared that this progress we've made will just disappear, that one day you'll wake up and decide this isn't worth it." He turned to face her fully, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. "Emily, I've spent my whole life clinging to things that don't matter. Money, control, reputation, but none of that ever filled the emptiness I felt after I pushed you away." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "I can't change the past, but I can promise you that I'm here now, and I'm not going to walk away. I want to be part of your life, whatever that looks like." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "I want that too, but I need you to accept me and my choices, even when they don't make sense to you. I'm learning," he said softly, "and I'm proud of the life you've built here. It's not the life I imagined for you, but it's yours, and that's what matters." Her lips trembled, and she set her coffee cup down on the railing. "That means more to me than you know." He reached out tentatively, his hand hovering in the space between them. She looked at it for a moment before taking it, her fingers wrapping around his. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was real. The first touch of a bridge that they had built together, plank by plank, over weeks of effort and understanding. "Thank you for coming back," she whispered. "Thank you for letting me," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. They stood there, father and daughter, holding on to each other not out of desperation, but out of hope. The breeze swept past them, carrying away old bitterness and leaving something new in its place, a tentative peace, a promise of more mornings like this. After a long moment, Emily pulled back, a smile breaking through the tears in her eyes. "We should get going. There's work to be done." Richard chuckled, wiping at his own eyes. "I'm ready." As they walked toward the barn together, The sun climbed higher, chasing away the shadows. The field stretched out before them, full of potential, just waiting to be nurtured, and for the first time in a long time, Richard felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. They weren't mending fences just for the farm anymore. They were mending them for each other, and every day, with every shared moment, the gaps closed a little more. This was a new beginning, hard-won, fragile, and precious, and it was enough, and it